Labor Day in Uganda um, is an annual event where the state, in most cases, dons, in my opinion, borrowed robes of solidarity, and the workers are actually what much like ceremonial castle uh, to sun-scorched fields and plastic chairs and parade themselves in terms of bureaucratic indifferences, in terms of megaphones and sceneries by way of celebrations. In my opinion, it's a performance. It's a tragic comedy based on the challenges in terms of the grave dignity or challenges that affect the individuals. In as far as I'm concerned, I would rather we call it a day of the jobless. Why? Because of the irony in terms of the challenges that people have. How does a nation, for example, with an unemployment rate, galloping beyond 9%, according to UBOS in 2023, with youth unemployment unofficially hovering around 64%, they even beat drums and even wave banners in honor of a celebration of so-called Labor Day. In my opinion, where does this come from? Walk into Wandagea, for example, or in Chisenyi, and see how many graduates are polishing border mirrors and even settling or even saving airtime or even hugging around with tomatoes and stuff like that. The employment is despicable. We were talking about celebrating, where celebrating becomes a grotesque, in my opinion. We're talking about challenges where people are actually having funeral-like homes way back. International Labor Organization, for example, conventions require not just the argument of celebrating labor, but the argument of protecting the creation of substantive jobs for ordinary Ugandans. Job creation it becomes a question that is extremely important rather than being politically choreographed, where we have people who ask, who do you know, rather than what do you have in terms of your documents, for example. I would rather we call this a struggle day, in my opinion, because in all honesty, there's a big challenge there. The aspect of unexploited or even forgotten informal sector. Over 80% of Uganda's workforce, lies in a limbo in one or the other. According to International Labour Organization, there are no contracts, there are no substantive amenities, the aspects of challenges as far as occupational safety is concerned, and the survival itself is a question of do or die. Take for example a woman who has to walk down the streets in a winter market, and she has to sell tomatoes or even onions, under tarpaulins, for example, for about 14 hours a day without even any substantive amenities. Later on, even short areas to go for short call, even clean water for that purpose. So resiliency for the ordinary people in Uganda is perhaps what should be celebrated, because the amenities for them to sustain themselves is really a big question. What precisely does Labor Day offer to such an individual? Is it a day off? Can she even afford to skip? Can she even afford to say, I'm not going to work today? Can she even afford to think that she can use the amenities that are going to come from that job to pay her school needs or her child's school, medical bills, for example? Talk about the aspect of wage salary masquerading as itself as an employment of itself. Civil servants line up for some time, for long periods of time without actually getting their monies. Their promotions are actually frozen on the inability for government to provide substantive amenities in terms of underscoring the challenges that befall them every day. How do they expect them to pay rents, for example, or to take care of their ill bodies, for example, or to take care of the landlords, who keep knocking left, right, and center because they still want the day. Even the private sector, we have some challenges in terms of the employment, where we barely do people even have lunch. When they go to job, they actually work on a frenzy and then come back at the end of the day and in the disguise of lunch. And yet we still call that we have to celebrate May 1st as an entity or as a day that is worthy to be celebrated in our country. The myth of the workers in terms of the union itself is another dilemma. Though we have trade unions in Uganda, they exist in law, but in effect, the National Organization for Trade Unions, for example, is reduced to simply an NGO in waiting, for example. There's really no substantive bargaining power in terms of between them and government, for example. How often have we seen them perhaps engaging vehemently or strongly for the cause of the ordinary people? And then you ask the ordinary people, ask the nurses, for example, ask the teachers, ask every factory worker, whether in industrial park, for example, in Mukono, who dare not even whisper conditions in terms of the changes, because they probably risk their jobs. They would rather be there at the expense of being there than simply rather than lingering around the streets of wherever they come from. So labor disputes tribunals, for example, do we even have them substantive enough to castrate, even fight for the needs of the ordinary people, for example? Talk about migrant labor, for example, in terms of the export that we have. How desperate the country has become. Every year Uganda exports tens of thousands of youth to the Middle East, for example, officially called so-called labor what externalization, if you like. This is nothing but some kind of outsourcing of poverty and even deprivation in one way or the other. Many are actually mistreated, and in the guise of giving them or promised jobs like drivers or security guards, and at the end of the day they can hardly bring back bread on table to the country there's so much pride in. Yeah. So my opinion, my observation is that Labor Day, to be honest, would actually be a day where people should come up and be able to celebrate what government has done for them in terms of creating substantive amenities and conditions that would help them, so that they can be able to milk this cow, not milk it to blood. That, in my opinion, that is something that we need to think about. The death of for example, mediocrity, for example, the rise of necropratic employment, for example. Yeah, in a country where the jobs are not advertised, for example, but they are whispered through, interviews, and then people have already secured their jobs. It's not a question of CV anymore. It's a question of who you know. These are questions that we need to address as a country, and they bite at the root. It's not a question of what did you study. It's a question of who did you know, or who did you talk to, or who did you give a bribe for example, to secure a job. That's why the most brilliant engineers become, border riders, and even visionary teachers actually become domestic workers in Dubai. Not because they're actually lazy, but because Uganda rewards allegiance and not ability. And that becomes a serious challenge for us as a nation. Yeah. So it's basically an international embarrassment, in terms of failing every global test of labor and justice, in my opinion. Uganda has actually ratified about 31 international labor organization conventions, for example, yet consistently violates them day to day. From gender discrimination, for example, in terms of these workplaces, to failure to enforce minimum wage policies, for example. Uganda's labor sector remains a breach in as far as these issues are concerned. In 2021, for example, the International Labour Organization cited Uganda's lack of enforcement mechanism as a grave concern. And this is serious business, my friend. Yeah. So what exactly are we celebrating on May 1st? Yeah. The government is inability to actually enforce every convention that it signed. Wait a minute. Can you wake up and smell the coffee? Do you understand that we have substantive challenges as a nation? Do we know that we're required to do better than what's happening today? And at the expense of a nation that is bleeding, there are certain individuals who are actually, swimming in opulence. And that's the disparage that we have today. In my opinion, the question is retire the masses and reform the labor. Labor Day in Uganda should actually not be celebrated. It should be, in my opinion, mourned. It should actually be a day of national soul searching, not sycophantic celebrations, for example. It should be a day where leaders listen, not even speak. Where workers are actually not abused, into stadia, for example, but their voices abused into parliament. Until we can actually generate, decent work for all, respect all workers' rights in terms of in terms of fair compensation, in terms of real employment opportunities, and even enforcement of labor laws, then Labor Day in Uganda remains a caustic, a masquerade, in my opinion. And to dance at it is actually a mock. And the very people who actually back still have a challenge in as far as making this nation a much better place. So let the speeches end and let justice begin. Once again, my name is Isaac Christopher Lubogo. Find most of our books at lubogo.org and suegennislawapp.com.